Today I'm going to look at the reproductive system. That's the system that allows us to create new humans. We're going to look at why we need reproductive systems, and then we're going to discuss their basic structures and their basic functions. First of all, let's consider why we need a reproductive system. Well, none of us live forever. Humans need to reproduce for the species to survive. That's why we need a reproductive system. Now, the process of reproduction involves mating or sex, and it is the organs and structures within our reproductive systems that allow that mating to occur. In this slide, we're considering some of the common features of both the male and female reproductive system. Both male and female have structures called gonads. These are the primary sex organs. In females, these are called ovaries. In males, they're called the testes. The gonads produce the gametes. These are the sex cells. These are going to unite to create a new individual. They're called oocytes in females and sperm in males. As well as the gonads and the gametes, we have accessory reproductive structures as well. For example, the ducting systems that allow the movement of gametes from the gonads towards the external environment. First of all, I'll consider an anatomical landmark for the reproductive system. It's the perineum. It's visible externally. It's a region formed of two triangles. The borders of these are formed by bones and structures of the pelvic girdle. For example, this region is bordered by the pubic symphysis anteriorly, ischial tuberosities laterally, and the coccyx posteriorly. Two distinct triangles are formed in this region. Firstly, a urogenital triangle that contains the urethral and vaginal orifices in females and the base of the penis and the scrotum in males. The posterior triangle in both sexes is referred to as the anal triangle and is the location of the anus. This shows the main structures associated with the male and female perineum. Notice the thigh regions here in both the females and males. Firstly, we have an anterior triangle here in both sexes. That's the urogenital triangle. Note the external genitalia here in the females, and in the male, at this point of the triangle here, we have the base of the scrotum. The posterior triangle is the anal triangle, and in both sexes this contains the anus. From this point on, we'll start looking at the anatomy of the female reproductive system. This system consists of internal and external genitalia. We'll spend most of our time looking at the internal genitalia. The external genitalia is collectively known as the vulva and involves structures such as the mons pubis, folds we call the labia majora and minora, and a sensory organ referred to as the clitoris. However, as I mentioned, we will spend most of our time looking at the internal genitalia, which includes a pair of ovaries, a pair of uterine tubes, a single uterus, and vagina. This provides an overview of a sagittal section showing the major organs of the female reproductive system. We're in the pelvic region here. I'll just point out a few of the most important structures, but it's up to you to go through this model in the practical and locate the structures for yourself. So, over here we have the ovary on one side of the body. That's one of the gonads. We have the uterine tube or fallopian tube. We have the uterus. And we have the vagina. They're all internal genitalia. External genitalia, such as the labia, are visible here, and the sensory organ, the clitoris, is there. Take note of adjacent structures, such as the urinary bladder and urethra of the urinary system, and elements of the digestive system, such as the rectum and anus. Now what I'll do is look at the organs of the female reproductive system in more detail. The logic I'll use for following these structures is to imagine that we're a gamete moving from the site of where the gamete is created, that's the ovary, to the point where it's released from the body. So I'll start with the ovaries. There are a pair of ovaries as indicated here in this simple diagram. Two ovaries lie lateral to the uterus, which I'm indicating now, held in place by ligaments. Key fact about the ovaries is that they are the female gonads, and it is here that the gametes, the female sex cells, will be created. Gametes, the oocytes, will mature in structures within the ovaries that we call follicles, and an ovary will contain follicles at different stages of development. This diagram highlights the location of the ovaries relative to other structures of the female reproductive system. Notice that the ovaries lie lateral to the uterus. Notice also the proximity of the uterine tubes. You'll notice the ovary on this side of the slide looks different to this one over here. What has happened here is that they've taken a frontal section of the ovary and you can see spherical structures within it. These are called follicles. Those are where the gametes are developing, and we'll talk about those soon. This diagram is also good for showing you a number of the ligaments which help suspend the ovary and associated structures into position. We have the broad ligament here, which is a double fold of peritoneum. We have the ovarian ligaments, which link the ovaries to the lateral walls of the uterus. We have suspensory ligaments, which attach ovaries to the lateral wall of the uterus. Notice the blood vessels passing through them. And over here we have a round ligament which passes through the inguinal canal. Now this is an important concept related to the ovaries. The ovaries are the sites of gamete formation in the females. The oocytes, that's the female gamete, mature in structures we call follicles. And what a follicle is, it's a structure that consists of an oocyte, that's the gamete, surrounded by supporting cells that are called follicular cells. At birth, the ovary is estimated to contain a lot of follicles, about 1.5 to 2 million of them. However, at birth, they're very immature. They exist in a form we call primordial. After birth, no new follicles are created. In fact, many will regress. A process called atresia occurs, where primordial follicles will regress. By the time puberty comes around, about 400,000 primordial follicles remain. And what puberty is when hormones from the anterior pituitary start to be secreted, and at that point the human female is able to enter the reproductive cycle of life. This shows an ovary that has been processed for a frontal section, and there are a few features to draw to your attention here. There are two distinct regions that are evident in this image. It's a relatively low power view of an ovary. Notice the outer cortex and an inner medulla. Many organs we look at will have an outer cortex and an inner medulla. The cortex is where the interesting stuff is happening for us. It is in the cortex of an ovary that we will find the gametes. Unfortunately, at this level of magnification, it's not possible to see the gametes. We need much higher levels of magnification to occur before we can do that. However, what we can see are the chambers where the gametes are maturing. These are the follicles. So the spherical follicles are visible, particularly these highly mature ones. The mature ones are the very large ones. So we can see here several follicles. Inside each one of these is a developing oocyte. However, we can't see the oocyte at this level of magnification. In these slides, I'm going to discuss the process of how follicles and the gametes within them mature. Now, as I mentioned before, at birth there's a very large number of primordial follicles. These are relatively immature structures. They're also very small. This slide shows some in a cat ovary, and we can see the small primordial follicles there. Relatively small. Primordial follicles, the only ones that are found in a sexually immature female. They contain an immature oocyte, that's the gamete, and a single layer of flat supporting cells called follicular cells. When puberty occurs, there will be evidence of maturation of some of the follicles occurring. During the ovarian cycle, which is regulated by hormones from the anterior pituitary, about 20 primordial follicles each month will start to mature. And what will happen is the oocyte will enlarge, so the gamete itself is getting bigger, and the supporting cells will also multiply. They'll take on more of a cuboidal shape and they'll start to multi-layer. And that's what's starting to happen with this one here. So this is a follicle here that is under the influence of pituitary hormones. It's now referred to as a primary follicle. This is another slide that shows the difference between primordial and primary follicles. So here we have the very small primordial follicles. As I said, by the time a human female hits puberty, there's about 400,000 of these. Each month during the ovarian cycle that's regulated by anterior pituitary hormones, several of these primordial follicles will start to enlarge, and we can see here a much larger gamete than over here, and you can also see evidence of the follicular cells starting to stratify and multilayer. So this now is starting to mature. That's called a primary follicle. Primary follicles will continue to enlarge, and when they get to the point where there's evidence of a fluid-filled cavity or antrum, that's when we call them secondary follicles. So a few of these primary follicles will get very large and become secondary follicles that have fluid-filled cavities. Now, typically in a human female, one of these secondary follicles will get extremely large and start to bulge from the surface of the ovary. That is what we call a Graphene follicle, and here's evidence of that now. So here we have an ovary, and look at this large spherical structure bulging from the surface. That's a Graphene follicle. It's very large. In a human female, this will actually suppress the development of other follicles. So only one will become dominant, and eventually, under the influence of pituitary hormones, it will release an oocyte. So there we have an oocyte ovulating from a Graphene follicle. So just to highlight that point, once an oocyte is released from a Graphene follicle, we call that process ovulation. Incidentally, that is regulated by hormones from the anterior pituitary. Now, once that process of ovulation has occurred, the Graphene follicle still has a role to play in the female reproductive cycle. In particular, it converts to an endocrine structure we call the Corpus Luteum. So this is representing a Corpus Luteum in an ovary, and this is in an actual section there. So this large structure, the Corpus Luteum. It's a yellow fibrous structure when it's not stained by histochemical stains, as is here. And what this structure does is that it produces hormones that act upon the uterus, and they make the lining of the uterus get thicker, hopefully so an embryo can embed into it, and then you can get fetal development occurring. If pregnancy doesn't occur, this structure will degenerate to a fibrous structure called the corpus albicans, and then we'll just regress back into the tissue. Once an oocyte ovulates from the ovary, it moves to the next stage of the female reproductive system, which is the uterine or fallopian tubes. Now, it's normally in the uterine tubes that fertilization occurs, so that's where the oocyte meets up with the sperm, and that's where you get formation of the embryo. Here we've got some of the structures associated with the uterine or fallopian tubes. There's an open funnel-shaped portion which is adjacent to the ovaries we call the infundibulum, and if you look at this closely, you'll notice these little finger-like projections called fimbria that help aid the entry of the oocyte into the uterine tube. The other structures of the uterine tubes include the ampulla, that's the longest portion of the tube, that connects with the infundibulum. The isthmus is the narrowest portion of the tube which attaches directly to the uterus, and then the portion of the tube that actually goes through the uterus is called the intramural segment. In this slide we'll just briefly review those structures of the uterine tubes that I've just mentioned. So we have the uterine tubes here on the superior and lateral aspect of the uterus. Notice them hanging over the ovary here. Now, it's important to mention that the uterine tubes do not connect directly to the ovaries. They just sort of hang over the top of them. Here we have an ovulating oocyte. The first portion of the uterine tubes that it will enter is the infundibulum, this funnel-shaped portion. Moving from there, we go to the ampulla, which is a relatively wide region. It then narrows down through the section we call the isthmus, and the section that actually projects through the wall of the uterus is the intramural segment. It's important to also mention that the process of getting the oocyte to enter the uterine tube is actively encouraged by structures within this uterine tube. There is, for example, layers of muscle in the tube that act and they rhythmically contract, which help to draw or massage the oocyte through the length of it. There are also fine hair-like cilia lining the surface of this structure, which beat rhythmically to create local currents to help move the oocyte through the system. Over here we have an animation that I'm going to put up soon that shows you the uterine tubes and how they are the sites where the two gametes meet. You'll see an oocyte here moving through the uterine tubes, and then it will meet up with a sperm down here. There'll be an embryo that forms, and then that embryo will embed itself in the uterus. And I'll just put the animation up now. So here we can see quite clearly the ovaries, the oocyte being released from those ovaries, while down here we have the sperm moving through the reproductive system, and at that point we just saw there the sperm and the oocyte unite. Then we have an embryo. The embryo then embeds in the wall of the uterus, what we call the endometrium. Now I just want to stress here that fertilization normally occurs in the uterine tubes. The uterine tubes connect with the uterus. That's a thick-walled, pear-shaped organ in the center of the pelvic cavity, and when there's no pregnancy occurring, these are the dimensions of that organ. They're the site of fetal development. Some of the structures we'll point out to you are the superior portion of the uterus, referred to as the body. Now the superior aspect of that body, the dome-shaped portion of it, which projects also anteriorly, is referred to as the fundus. And we also saw a dome-shaped structure called the fundus in the stomach. So the term fundus used in locations other than just the uterus. The uterus is also characterized by an inferior cervix. The cervix contains a canal, the cervical canal. It's a narrow passageway. The openings to the cervical canal are called the internal and external os. So we'll see these in the next diagram. This shows the structures of the uterus I was just speaking about here. The superior body, the inferior cervix, and the superior component of the body is the fundus. There is a canal running through the cervix of the uterus, and notice the openings, the external os and the internal os to those structures. Notice also the uterine tubes that we were speaking of before, and then the ovaries here. If we look at the uterus and have a look at the cells and tissues within it, there are distinct layers that are evident. The outermost layer is called the peritoneum, and that's continuous with the visceral peritoneum. There is the myometrium. This contains layers of smooth muscle going in different orientations, and this smooth muscle is important for assisting the childbirth process. The most interesting functional layer for us is the endometrium. This is the layer that undergoes major changes each month during the female reproductive cycle. The endometrium is the layer of material into which the embryo will embed and develop. It's composed of layers of epithelial tissue and supporting connective tissue. This is a low power view of a uterus highlighting those layers. An outer peritoneum, which at some point will link with the visceral peritoneum, the muscular myometrium, important for childbirth, and the thick endometrium here. Now the endometrium here is quite thick, but the thickness of this will change dramatically during the female reproductive cycle, and it's influenced by hormones from the ovaries, and we talked about the corpus luteum making some of those hormones before. When you look at the endometrium, you can see these lines. They are glands, uterine glands. They will help support and nurture, and they provide secretions that will help support and nurture an embryo should it implant in this structure. The final structure of the internal genitalia of the female that I'll consider is the vagina. Basically, this is a tubular muscular organ that links the uterus to the body exterior. It's the passageway for childbirth and menstrual flow. We'll highlight some regions of it. It has a body which extends from the fornix to the pelvic floor. Now the fornix is a recess which exists between the vaginal part of the cervix and the wall of the vagina, and I'll point that out to you in a figure in a minute. Rugae are present in the vagina, and this is indicating that this organ needs to go and expand sometimes. Other organs that we've seen rugae in include the urinary bladder and the stomach, and all those organs need to expand. The rugae, the folds, allow that expansion to occur. Now, we've seen this image of the internal genitalia of the female before, but what we're emphasizing now is this region here, where the vagina is. There's the main body of the vagina. Notice the folds, the ruga, that facilitate expansion. And here are the recesses that I referred to before, the lateral fornix. So you can see that there. Fornix literally means arch. I'll just briefly mention now one other structure associated with the female reproductive system, the mammary glands. And these will help with nourishment of the infant once it's born, and also in helping to provide immunity from infection. So you have these glands, mammary glands, that are located in the breasts. And the rest is basically a mound of tissue that overlies the pectoralis major muscles. These enlarge at puberty and contain many glands that develop during pregnancy and remain active in lactating mothers. And here are the glands that we're interested in, the mammary glands. They're the ones that produce the breast milk that nourishes the newborn. There's about 15 to 20 mammary glands in each breast, and each gland has its own ducting system. It eventually projects to these lactiferous ducts, which open at the nipple. Notice also the presence of a lot of adipose tissue and suspensory supporting ligaments. So that finishes our overview of the female reproductive system. Now we'll progress to the male reproductive system. The male reproductive system has many basic roles that are similar to that of the female reproductive system. For example, it is responsible for the production of gametes, just like the female reproductive system was. However, instead of making oocytes, the male reproductive system makes sperm. The male reproductive system also has a range of structures to allow delivery of these gametes, the sperm, into the female reproductive system, where fertilization will occur. The male reproductive system, like the female reproductive system, also makes a range of hormones which are important for the reproductive process. This shows the major organs that we're going to look at associated with the male reproductive system, and I'll just provide a very brief overview now. We'll look at the gonads, which are these testes. We'll look at the ducting system that links to the testes, structures such as the epididymis, Ductus Deferens, urethra. We'll look at glands that make secretions that will help nurture or support the male gametes in some way, structures such as the prostate gland. And then there's a range of other structures, such as the penis here, that play some role in the reproductive process. This slide just summarizes what I was saying before. The major structures of the reproductive system in males that we're going to look at: the gonads, where the male sperm are made; the ducting system, that store and transport the semen, the sperm and fluids, and also urine; accessory glands such as the prostate gland, which provide fluid secretions that help nurture and support the cellular sperm; and also other structures of the male reproductive system such as the penis and scrotum. Initially, I'll look at the testes. So we'll follow the same basic approach we followed with the female reproductive system. We'll start with the gonads, and then we'll follow the journey that a gamete would take if it was moving from the gonad in a particular sex to the external environment. So if you're in the male reproductive system and you're a gamete, you start in the testes. The testes exist in a structure we call the scrotum. It's a sac of abdominal skin and fascia sheets of connective tissue, and the testes exist in this scrotum, there and there. The testes, the two of them, are separated by a partition we call the septum. Now, an important concept associated with the scrotum is that it helps regulate temperature. Optimal sperm development does not occur at the core body temperature of 37 degrees. It occurs at a lower temperature, about 33 degrees. So we need to be able to regulate temperature to cool the testes from core body temperature so sperm development can occur. Allowing us to do that, we have some cooling mechanisms in place, and these are associated with muscle layers. Firstly, we have layers of smooth muscle called dartos muscle. That causes the skin of the scrotum to wrinkle, and that helps with cooling. We also have cremaster muscle. That's bands of skeletal muscle that help raise the testes if it's too cold. This shows in detail some of the key structures I was talking about before. Here we've peeled back all the material that's covering the testes. An individual testis is indicated here, and we can see the layers of material that are covering it. We have the smooth muscle, dartos muscle, that wrinkles the scrotum to help with cooling. That will help cool the testes. We also have this material here, cremaster muscle, that is skeletal muscle. If it gets too cold, this will pull the testes closer to the body core and help warm things up a bit. We have layers of connective tissue we call fascia. That's this white material here. That's just sheets of fibrous connective tissue. Notice also how we tend to channel a number of structures through this cord-like structure here. We have veins, we have arteries, we have parts of the male ducting system and nerves, all channeled through this structure here that's called the spermatic cord. Now I'll spend some time discussing the specific structures found within the testes. They're the male gonads. Initially these develop within the posterior abdominal wall, and they will then descend into the scrotum during the 7th month of embryonic development. If they don't descend, we have a condition called cryptochidism that can result. This can cause the testes to be held within the body cavity where it's sitting at about 37 degrees. Now that is too high for effective sperm development, so the male can actually become functionally sterile if the testes do not descend effectively into the scrotum. If you look inside the testes, you'll find lots and lots of tightly coiled tubes we call the seminiferous tubules. This is where the sperm are formed, and in particular they arise from a type of cell we call spermatogonia. This shows the anatomy of the testes, or as we see here, an individual one that's called the testis. I'll draw to your attention some important structures now. We have a layer of material here called the tunica vaginalis. That's actually an extension of the peritoneum. You can see this sort of double layered structure here. There's then a layer of connective tissue covering the testes called the tunica vaginalis. Look inside, and now we see some really important structures, the seminiferous tubules. These are the ones where we find sperm formation occurring. 1 to 3 tubes, 1, 2 or 3 tubes tightly coiled together in little partitions we call lobules. The lobules are formed by extensions of the tunica vaginalis inside the testis. So here is where the sperm arise. The sperm will then be moved. They'll converge to this area here, the posterior and superior aspect of the testis, at a point we call the rete testis. We then enter a ducting system that takes the sperm to this structure here we call the epididymis. Sperm maturation will actually continue in this structure, so you'll store the sperm here, they'll continue to mature, and if they're not used they can be reabsorbed here too. From there, sperm will move towards the next part of the ducting system, which is the Ductus Deferens or Vas Deferens. Notice the 180 degree turn down here. Also important to point out at this structure here, there is the spermatic cord, that tube-like structure I drew to your attention before that contains blood vessels, nerves, and parts of the male ducting system, which we see here, the Vas Deferens. As we saw in the previous slide, each testis is filled with tightly coiled seminiferous tubules, and if you look at a slide that's made from the testes, you'll see evidence of this tubing system, very densely packed with the tubes going in all sorts of different directions. The tubes are lined by an epithelial cell type, and it has a couple of different major populations of cells within it. Those involved in forming the gametes, that is, those involved in spermatogenesis, that's the formation of the gametes, or the maturation of the gametes, that's a process we call spermiogenesis. The other major population are the supporting cells. These don't make sperm, but they support the cells that do. There are also cells that exist between the seminiferous tubules called interstitial cells, and within those is a population of cells called Leydig cells that make testosterone that's important for the sperm maturation process. This shows a high-powered view of the testes And what we can see are tube-like structures, seminiferous tubules. These are the points where sperm formation occurs. The cells here are a type of epithelial cell. There are those that are involved in forming the sperm and those involved in helping the sperm-forming cells to carry out their role. Look closely in the centre or lumen of the tubule. You might be able to make out little tail-like structures. So here we have the spermatozoa, or sperm as we commonly refer to them as, and we'll show you some animations of the sperm in a minute. So within each of these seminiferous tubules you'll have sperm being formed. Those are the male gametes. Notice that between the seminiferous tubules you have cells, interstitial cells, and within that interstitial cell population are Leydig cells that make testosterone. That's important for the sperm forming process. This is showing you what is being made in the seminiferous tubules. So once you get to the centre of the seminiferous tubules, these should be evident. Sperm with their distinctive head where the DNA is contained, midpiece and tail, the tail providing the propulsion. So once the sperm leave the testes, they then travel through a series of ducts. The aim of it will be to get the sperm out of the body and into the female reproductive system. The ducts that we're going to look at this point include the efferent ductals of the testes, the duct of the epididymis, the ductus or vas deferens, and the ejaculatory duct. Beyond this point, we then join up with the urethra, which provides the passageway for not only the male reproductive system, the gametes and the semen, but also for the urine from the renal system. This shows us the major elements of the male duct system. So the key thing we're trying to draw to your attention here is that we have the male gonads here where the sperm are made. They need to be delivered into the female reproductive system. So you have your seminiferous tubules there. They will converge to the testes within the testes, then into the duct of the epididymis, into the Vas Deferens or Ductus Deferens. And you'll notice that as we project here, inferior and posterior portion of the urinary bladder we're adjacent to here, as we get to this point, we then enter this ducting system here, which is the urethra, which takes urine from the urinary bladder out of the body. Now at this point it's important to mention a couple of structures that we'll be referring to later. Notice that sitting just inferior to the urinary bladder we have this gland here. That is the prostate gland. The urethra passes through that. So in this channel here, urine and semen will pass through this. Seminal vesicles are here. These are accessory sex glands. These also contribute to the semen. Notice that there's a point where, from this point here at the base of the seminal vesicles, there's a junction between there and the ductus deferens on each side. The little portion just inferior to that, so here we have the junction of the seminal vesicles, the ductus deferens on each side. Just inferior to that you have a small portion we call the ejaculatory duct. There's one on each side. That is actually passing through the prostate gland and it will link up with the urethra. And we'll talk about the urethra next. Before we do that, however, I'll just summarise some of the structures I was speaking about before. We had the ducts within the epididymis. We have the ductus or vas deferens that I mentioned before. That's quite a long portion of the male ducting system, about 45 centimetres. This is the part of the male duct system that is cut to allow the male to be sterilised through what we call a vasectomy. There was also that small ejaculatory duct that I mentioned that's formed by the union of the ductus deferens and the seminal vesicle, and there's two of those, one on each side of the body. They pass through the prostate gland and they will eventually connect with the urethra within the prostate gland. Another final thing to mention at this point is that the tubing system, the ducting system, is quite muscular at this point, so there is propulsion of the fluid through the male ducting system. Now, as I mentioned before, the male ducting system that I've just spoken about there, the ejaculatory duct, the vas deferens and so on, will eventually connect with the ducting system that carries urine out of the body, the male urethra. We've spoken about this before, so I won't spend too long on it today. Three main regions can be found in the male urethra. One that runs through the prostate gland, it's relatively short. There's also a short urogenital urethra that runs through the urogenital diaphragm. And there's a penile or spongy urethra that runs through the penis. And we've spoken in length about these in the urinary system lecture, so I'll only briefly mention them again. And this is just a diagram highlighting the regions of the male urethra. So draw your attention here to the urinary bladder passing through, and now we have the urethra firstly passing through the prostate gland. The region I'm showing you here is the ejaculatory duct. Notice how the ejaculatory duct will link with the urethra, and there'll be another one on the other side. But getting back to the urethra, here we have the prostatic urethra. Then this small strip here of skeletal muscle is where we find the membranous urethra. Then the majority of the urethra running through the penis, the penile urethra. Located along the length of the male ducting system and the urethra are a series of glands which create secretions that in some way will nurture and support the gametes that are created in the males. So the sperm will be supported or nurtured in some way by secretions from these accessory glands of the male reproductive system. The three main ones that contribute towards the production of semen are the two seminal vesicles and the single prostate gland. There is also a couple of small glands we call the bulbourethral glands. They make a minor contribution to the semen, but they're also important for providing lubricating fluid prior to the copulation process. So here are the glands that make the fluids and the secretions that we find in semen. That's the fluid that helps nurture, support and protect the male gametes once they leave the male reproductive system. We have a couple of these seminal vesicles on the posterior wall of the bladder. We have this single prostate gland here that encircles the urethra inferior to the urinary bladder, and we have a couple of these small bulbourethral, or also Cowper's glands they're referred to, which all of them will contribute some sort of fluid secretion that will contribute to the male reproductive process. In particular, the prostate and the seminal vesicles contribute materials that nurture and support the gametes. All of them eventually empty their contents into the male urethra. The final structure I'll consider with relation to the male reproductive system is the penis, and this is a device to place the gametes, the male sperm, inside the female reproductive system. It does this because it has these masses of erectile tissue. So to be able to contribute to the reproductive process, the penis has to become erect, and there are these three cylindrical masses of erectile tissue to allow that to occur. They are permeated by vessels we call blood sinuses, which during the erection process they become filled with blood. The names of these erectile tissue structures are the two corpora cavernosa, located dorsally and laterally on the penis, and then there's a single corpus spongiosum, mid-ventral, and this is the one that contains the spongy urethra. This shows the major anatomical structures associated with the penis. I'll draw to your attention the erectile tissue structures that I mentioned before. We have the corpus cavernosa, two of those, dorsolateral aspect of the penis, and a single corpus spongiosum, mid-ventral. You can see here the blood sinuses that are indicated, so they're indicating blood vessels there, and blood will fill that during the erection process. This one here, the corpus spongiosum, that's the one that the urethra passes through. And that concludes the lecture on the reproductive systems.